One of the most magnetic moments that draws us, ordinary people, to shul, no matter the weather, is a loved one's yahrtzeit. It's the anniversary that our mother died. It's the anniversary that our father died. It's the anniversary that a grandparent or relative died. And people who don't usually come around to minyan will show up for minyan for their loved one's yahrtzeit. They will show up in all kinds of weather. They will show up no matter the snow. They'll show up no matter the ice. They'll show up no matter the cold. They don't usually show up, but for this, they show up. It's a precious opportunity to say that their mother still matters. It's a precious opportunity to say that I still feel you, I still care. It's a precious opportunity to share some words, to bring their story back to light. It's a precious opportunity to say, Kaddish, Yitkadal, V'Kadash, Shemei Rabbah, for my loved one, and the community answers. And people will do this for years, for decades. And if you have a practice of coming to minyan, you will see that people often say Kaddish for their loved one longer than they had their loved one. Now, when people come and observe the yahrtzeit of their loved one, a thing we say, a thing that you hear is, may you be your mother's living legacy. May you continue to be your father's living legacy. May your loved one's values live on in you. And we say it, and we mean it, and it's beautiful, and it's true. But I have to say that I recently observed the yahrtzeit for my father 10 days ago, and for the first time in my life, I experienced a tension, a complexity, a wrinkle that I had never experienced before. And here's the question. What happens when our loved one that we're remembering and us who are remembering them have a very different point of view on an important matter of principle? They think this way, and they're committed. And we think very differently. Now what do? They lived. They died. We know where they stand. But where they stand is not where we stand. How do we think then of being their legacy? So I experienced this tension on Chai Kislev, the Hebrew anniversary of my father's passing, December 19th. I was observing the 43rd yahrtzeit of my father. He died when I was 20, and I have been saying Kaddish for him for 43 years. And on this day that I was marking his yahrtzeit, I was also on the same day doing something not only that he would have disagreed with. I was doing something he would have disagreed with every fiber of his being. I was, it's just the fates had it, the mysteries of invisible connection. On his yahrtzeit, I was doing something that was the antithesis of his clearest and strongest messaging to me. How do we think about that? So here's the backstory. The backstory is that the leadership of the conservative movement is rethinking its position on intermarriage. And a guy named Jacob Blumenthal, who is the CEO of the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the Union of Conservative Rabbis, and double nachas, he's also the CEO of the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the lay arm and the rabbinic arm. He came to see me and Michelle, and he came to say that the leadership of the conservative movement is rethinking its position on intermarriage, and that it realizes that for the last 50, 60 years, it has gotten this issue wrong. Since the 1970s, the position of the movement has been that intermarriage is a wrong, and that the rabbi role should be to discourage it and to try to prevent it from happening. And if our clergy won't officiate at intermarriage, and if our bulletins won't announce intermarriage, and if interfaith couples cannot have an aliyah, an ufrah, to celebrate their wedding, then all of that discouragement will discourage intermarriage. And the leadership of the conservative movement now recognizes that that position never worked, not for a day, not once, and that it's not working now. And they now want to move to a position that is intermarriage is a reality, and it is an opportunity, and that the rabbi role is to cultivate deep and loving connections with interfaith families and to bring them ever closer to God and Torah and mitzvah. So Rabbi Blumenthal came to see us because even though that is the position of some leading rabbis and lay leaders who are evolving on this issue, they still take the position that conservative rabbis cannot officiate at intermarriage. And I get that that's their position, and I respectfully but very strongly disagree with that position. And I believe that conservative rabbis should be vested with the discretion to perform an intermarriage if we believe that that's the best chance of keeping the next generation of Jews Jewishly educated and connected and inspired. And I want to be able to do an intermarriage if I think that's the best way to keep children and grandchildren connected to Torah and mitzvah. And Rabbi Blumenthal came to Temple Emanuel, met with me and Michelle in my study, and asked if I would write a position paper stating the rationale for that, which I did, and I was working on that on the very day that I was saying Kaddish for my father. And here's the rub. My father, one of his core principles was that a Jew can only marry a Jew. A Jew can only marry a Jew, either somebody who was born Jewish or somebody who becomes Jewish through conversion. But if a Jew were to marry a non-Jew, the response would be to disown that person, to cut off all contact. And that was not an idle threat. That actually happened in my own family. Now, I shared this story in 2016 when my mother died and I was sitting Shiva in the Gant Chapel. So if you heard this story, forgive me. But I need to tell this story again, which is that my mother had a sister named Esther, unusual name, Esther, E-S-T-A. And Esther was 15 years younger than my mother. There were four daughters. My mother was the oldest, then two others, and then Esther. 15 years apart, oldest and the youngest. They were bookend sisters, and they were deeply, 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 deeply connected. Rosine and Esther, my mother and Esther, loved one another deeply. And Esther was the same age because of the age difference. And my mother got married super young. She got married when she was 17, and she had her first kids when she was 18 and 20. My mother had older daughters who were basically Esther's age. And Esther had a tough growing up with asthma, childhood asthma, etc. Anyway, in her early 20s, Esther meets and falls in love with and knows happiness for the first time, falling in love with a non-Jewish man. And they get married. And my parents decide to disown Esther. They're going to cut off contact with Esther. This was very painful for my mother especially, because she loved Esther. But at the same time, she had daughters who were of dating age, and they just felt this is what they needed to do to send the message that interdating and intermarriage are forbidden. So Esther gets married. My family cuts off contact with Esther. And one day in her 20s, Esther dies of an asthma attack, a sudden asthma attack. And when she dies, my mother had not been talking to Esther. My mother was in her 30s when this happened. Roll the film forward 60 years. My mother is now in her 90s, and she's dying. And she's in her final chapter, the Life Care Center of Aurora. And I'm sitting at her bedside, and she has a nightstand right by her bedside. And on the nightstand is a picture of young Esther and her husband, so young, so happy. And my mother, when looking back at her life, says, I can never forgive myself. I can never forgive myself that I cut off my own sister. I can never forgive myself. I am going to go to my grave carrying this pain. And that picture of Esther and her young husband that was on the nightstand at my mother's bedside at the Life Care Center of Aurora is now on my desk at Temple Emmanuel. And no doubt fuels my passion in this area. So, on the same day, I'm saying Yitkadal v'Kadash Shemei Rabbah for my father, and I am trying to do my own version of repair, trying to make the case that conservative rabbis should be vested with the discretion to perform intermarriage. And my question is, how do we make sense of that kind of creative tension? And I had and have an extreme form of that. But if you think about your parents who lived and died, if you think about your grandparents who lived and died, if you think of all the people you say Kaddish for, all the people you remember on Yizkor, all the people you remember during their yahrtzeit, odds are there's stuff you disagree with. Odds are you're not eye to eye on every point. And so my question is, how do we lovingly remember somebody that we disagree with on a fundamental and passionate point? As always, our Torah reading speaks directly to the issues of our day. The Joseph story that we're in the middle of gives us 3 different generations. And each generation has a different lived experience, which gives them a different lens, which gives them a whole different way to see the world. In the Joseph story, the grandfather generation is Jacob, of course. And Jacob is born in Canaan. And he spends 110 of his first 130 years in Canaan. And Jacob is the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. And he knows that the covenant of God and the Jewish people through his family, rooted in the land of Israel, is in his bones. That's Jacob, the grandfather. Joseph is the middle generation. And he leaves Canaan when he is 17. And he then spends from 17 to 110 in Egypt. And he becomes an Egyptian. He becomes a powerful government official in Egypt. He marries an Egyptian woman. His father-in-law is the high priest of the religious faith of Egypt. They raise 2 children in Egypt. And he goes back to Canaan exactly one time, and that is to bury his dad. And when that task is completed, he comes back to Egypt. And then there's Manasseh and Ephraim. They are born in Egypt, and they live in Egypt, and they die in Egypt, and there is no evidence that they ever left Egypt. In fact, the Torah is explicit that when Jacob dies, his children go and bury him, but his grandchildren don't even go to bury their grandfather in Canaan. That's how Egyptian they are. And the Torah, in its powerful way, in just 2 words, conveys all of this generational difference. Just so powerful. Just so powerful. Jacob is looking at his Egyptian grandsons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he says, Mi Elah. Who are they? Who are they? The grandfather looking at his grandchildren. They're so different. Mi Elah. Who are they? The lenses, the lived experiences are so different. So what does all of this mean as we process our own generational diversity? It means that context matters in shaping a life, and that our grandparents' context was different from our parents' context, is different from our context, is different from our children, is different from our grandchildren. And every one of those lived experiences that could be so dramatically different shapes how we see the world. I can share this with my dad with just one word. My father's name at birth was Nathan. Nathan appears on his birth certificate, and Nathan appears on his death certificate. And in between, nobody ever called him Nathan. Nobody. Everybody in all walks of his life and forever always called him only one word, which is Dempsey. What's Dempsey? So my father came by his suspicion of non-Jews, very honestly. His mother, my blubby Sarah Gardenswartz, she personally experienced the pogrom of the Kishinev massacre in 1904. And she came to America. She was part of the Americans who came to America after Kishinev pogrom. She knew from pogroms firsthand. My father was born in Denver in 1916. He grew up in a very poor neighborhood. It was multi-ethnic, and it was tough, and it was before the golden age of American Jewry. And he grew up at a time when Jewish kids were regularly attacked and regularly insulted by young anti-Semitic kids. And my father would just always get in fistfights defending the dignity of Jews. And at the time, there was a big boxer named Jack Dempsey. And my dad got into fistfights every day with anti-Semites. And so as a schoolyard kid, he was called Dempsey, and that name just stuck. So what does that mean for us? It means that the dynamic of Jacob, born and lives most of his life in Canaan, and Joseph leaves Canaan, becomes Egyptian, and Ephraim and Manasseh, born, raised, and died in Egypt. Mi Elah, who are they? So different? That also applies to all of us. I could not relate to Kishinev as a living category. I mean, I know the story, it's history. But for my dad, who had a mother who went through Kishinev, it was personal. I never got in a fistfight with anybody who called me an anti-Jewish slur. My dad got into fistfights all the time. Small wonder that he believed what he believed, and that he emerged to adulthood thinking Jews should marry Jews. And the flip is also true. Mi Elah. My dad died in 1981. How much has the world changed since 1981. And therefore, my father couldn't experience the world that has shaped my thinking. So, what do we owe the people that we love and that we remember? We don't owe them agreement. We do not owe them agreement. What we owe them is generosity of spirit and understanding and empathy and love. I certainly have that, and much more for my father. I can only hope he has that in heaven for me. But in the meantime, down on earth, I've evolved my greeting to people who observe a yahrtzeit. I no longer say, may you be your loved one's living legacy. I say, may you find your own way to be your loved one's living legacy. May you find your own way, because after all, isn't that the greatest love of all? What a great love is that? That even though we disagree on an important matter of principle, I love you so much forever and always that I will spend the rest of my life trying as best as I can in my own way to perpetuate your values. Shabbat Shalom.